One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back. Before we get started, I want to give a shout out to a few people who have been listening and I've come in contact with through one means or another. First is a shout out and a big thank you to Robin, who pointed out that when I was talking about the Eisenhower matrix, that I referred to Eisenhower as the president during World War II, when in fact, at that period of time, he was actually a general and didn't become president until about 10 years or so later. Thank you, Robin, for that correction. And also, I want to give a big shout out to Amy and Kelly. Amy and Kelly are a couple of functional medicine practitioners who work with Dr. Ashley. Guys, Dr. Ashley tells me that you guys are doing a bang-up job and that you guys are big fans of the podcast. So I hope to meet you guys at a seminar at some point in the future, sometime soon. Okay, let's go into this. This last episode, we talked in general about some of the amazing facts about the gut, right? Mostly about how it is a system of systems where your neurological, hormonal, and immunological systems all converge in one place. And that's probably why the gut is so often involved in health issues, and also why it's both important, if not urgent, in that Eisenhower matrix. And if you don't know what that is, just back up a couple of episodes to the introduction to this gut series that we're in as part of the functional hierarchy of health. Now, in this episode, I want to talk a little bit about lab testing for gut issues. And I'm going to try to strike a balance between being informative, but trying to be concise. Literally, I could talk about this stuff for hours. And there's a lot of different lab tests that we can talk about for the gut, but I'm going to cone it down to the things that are most useful. You might remember sometime last year, I think it was, I did a series called, lab tests that I wouldn't order for myself and lab tests that I would. And I talked about tier 1 testing, and certainly gut testing, specifically stool testing, is part of my tier 1 sorting out, if you will. But let me start off by addressing the question as to whether or not you actually need to have a stool test to make decisions about doing some kind of a gut protocol. And the answer is maybe. So here's the deal. Like, you don't need any testing to start any given supplement protocol, but launching into treatment, whether that's with a provider like myself or self-directed, doing that without some objective data means that you're doing so blinded to some degree. And, there are many cases where that might be okay. A lot of people just simply read about something, hear about something, get a recommendation from a friend or whatever, and they do something simple and it really helps their gut quite a bit. And that's wonderful. But in some cases, that's really not the best decision because their problems go beyond. It's not like all gut problems are the same. There's and I feel like I keep using the word scale and spectrum all the time, which I do, because that is the way the human system works. And it's the nature of the types of problems that we have. So you can have a little teeny tiny gut problem, or you can have a really massive gut problem. And in some cases, you absolutely need objective data and testing to sort out what's going on so you can determine what the best approach or the best protocol is. So for example, again, my one-on-one coaching programs with individuals, I'll often tell people with SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, that we don't really need to do a stool test to get started, but we do need a stool test at some point in the future. And the reason for that is that with SIBO, because it's such a complex problem, the protocols that we use for that pretty much cover the entire gamut of gut programming or protocols. And so having a stool test up front isn't going to change all that much for us. And so what's the point of doing a pre-test if it's not going to change what you do? And that's a critical point to make, right? The decision to perform any given lab test is based on whether or not it will change either your basic understanding of a problem or change what you do. In most cases, if it won't, then we don't do the test. But if it will, then we do it. Now, having said that, I'm not against ordering a lab test or even an imaging study like a CT scan or perhaps an MRI, not because I need it, but because the person I'm working with wants to know that they know something or that they know something isn't there. And here's an example. And this is just one that comes off the top of my head because it's fairly recent. I was working with a young lady not long ago who was having really bad headaches as part of her symptom picture. Of course, she had seen a multitude of other doctors, but she was really worried that something was wrong with her brain. And even though through my analysis of her prior records, her history, her diagnostics that we had at that point, nothing pointed to something that was big, bad, or scary. But I agreed to order the MRI simply for her peace of mind. I was confident that it was going to come back normal. Of course, I could have been wrong. Of course, I could have been wrong. But I knew that the stress and the anxiety of her worrying about some potential unknown was going to get in the way of all the work that we were trying to do with her diet, her lifestyle, her supplementation protocols. And the reason for that is very simple, because chronic stress will derail your best efforts very, very easily. So we ordered the MRI, it came back completely normal, which meant that she could lay aside all of her anxiety and her worry and start getting to work on the things that were going to make a difference for her. And, thankfully, in fact, I just got off the phone with her about 10 minutes ago before starting recording this. She's doing quite well, which is wonderful to be able to say. And this is one of the beautiful things that I love about functional medicine and not being tied to conventional medicine and the health insurance system, because I don't have anyone looking over my shoulder telling me what I can and can't do as a doctor. Like, I get to do what's right for my clients and not what the insurance company tells me I'm allowed to do or what's right for the insurance company. That's probably a topic for a different day. So if we go back to this idea that you may or may not need to pre-test your gut with a stool test, for example, in order to commit to some course of action. And again, the answer is usually, but not always. So in one case, when someone has SIBO, you probably don't need it because whatever you do for SIBO is going to cover pretty much everything. And let me make another point here. SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, is an infection that happens in the upper small intestine, which is that portion of your gut that's right after the stomach. And stool testing doesn't show us what's happening up there, right? Stool testing can really only tell us what's happening at the other end of your gut, the very end of your large intestine and the colon, because that's where the majority of your gut microbial activity is. So think of it this way. Stool testing tells us about what happens at the far end of your gut, while SIBO happens at the beginning section. And you might remember I think it was the last episode, I mentioned that your brain controls the valves that keep your gut compartmentalized so that food and debris flows from top to bottom, right? From mouth to anus. So your gut is separated into segments, and each segment has its own testing methodology. So stool testing is for the large intestine and the colon area, while there is other testing, usually some form of breath testing for the upper small intestine. The gut is one continuous thing, but it's segmented, and testing strategies should reflect that. Another case where someone might not need a stool pre-test is when it's so obvious that they have an infected gut that you really don't need the pre-test. But that doesn't mean you don't need, again, a post-test after you've done a gut protocol, which might take maybe 8 to 12 weeks or so on average. So here's a scenario, and I apologize in advance for the ick factor. Let's say that when you have a bowel movement, that there's mucus and pus and little white wiggly things in your stool. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to think, I think I have a parasite, right? And this happens. I have patients, clients texting me photos sometimes of hey, doc, what do you think this is? So you could argue that maybe there's other stuff going on in your gut than what you can see in your bowel movements, that maybe you need a stool test to define additional things, right? After all, good stool testing is not going to pick up only on parasites, but bacteria and fungal and certain viral species. And there is some merit to think that if you know which type of infection someone has, that this allows you to pick the most effective supplement strategy to get rid of it. Because over the years, natural medicine practitioners have declared in some way that certain herbal remedies are for specific problems. For example, if you have a bacterial infection, many natural medicine people will say, well, you need to use something like berberine because it's antibacterial. It kills bacteria. Or you might have a parasitic infection and someone says, well, you might want to choose like Artemisia or wormwood or maybe black walnut hulls because these are quote unquote antiparasitic. Or fungal infections, docs are going to tend to gravitate towards things like caprylic or undecylenic acid because these are traditionally considered to be antifungal remedies. And so you have certain herbs and certain remedies that are basically pigeonholed, right? And there is some truth to this. These herbs are not simply arbitrarily assigned to one use or the other. There is some research that backs this up. But I have two problems with these general classifications. One is that each of these herbs, while perhaps best known for specific things, are actually poly-antimicrobial. That means potentially effective against a wide range of pathogens. So while berberine is generally considered to be antibacterial, it's also effective against some fungal infections. And Artemisia or wormwood, again, generally classified as an antiparasitic, has antifungal and antiviral properties. And so what's happened again is that we've pigeonholed these herbs to make it seem like they do one thing and one thing only, and that's simply not true. And that leads me to another point to make, that it's unusual to have an infected gut where there's only one type of pathogen, especially if you're in the chronic setting, right? If somebody with a healthy gut gets acute food poisoning, it's quite probable that a stool test would just show elevated salmonella. But someone who's had a bad gut over years, if not decades, most likely has a combination of potential pathogens in their gut. And so we have studies that show that upwards of 80% of the time when there is one type of critter, there are others, especially if you have something called biofilm, which is, again, a topic for a different day. But I've talked about that in different episodes. So you might want to go to the search bar and just type in the word biofilm on the podcast, and you'll come up with the episodes where I've talked about biofilm. So really, on a clinical side, it behooves us to think more broadly and to realize that perhaps our best strategies are to think in terms of multiple pathogen types and to choose herbs that exhibit the ability to be effective against more than one type of critter, because after all, shouldn't you cover as many bases as possible? And there's probably one more thing to add here, and that is that, like, you understand how we as humans are genetically similar, yet we are distinct. Right? We can think of human DNA and say that as a group, we all have the same human DNA. But as individuals, your DNA and your DNA blueprint can be substantially different from mine, such that you might be taller or shorter than I am, or have different hair or eye color. And you can have a different genetic potential for diseases, like whether it's heart disease or cancer or something else. Yet when it comes to microbes that infect us, we tend to think that they're all the same. And that what kills one type of critter will kill all instances of that critter. And that also is not true, right? There's as much genetic variability among microbial species of similar type as there is among humans. So let's say you and I both have the same bacterial infection, let's say H. pylori, which is very common. The simplistic and naive approach says that we can use the same treatment protocol for everybody, whether that's berberine or mastica, for example, and it's going to be equally effective for everybody. Not necessarily true. Maybe berberine as an antibacterial works for you, but not for me, even though we have the exact same named infection, H. pylori. Maybe what kills my infection is not berberine or mastica, but maybe it's actually an antiparasitic, something like Artemisia. Or maybe it's olive leaf extract or something else, or even better yet, a combination of things that have different capacities. So we have to be willing, again, not to pigeonhole treatment strategies and say, if this, always that. Like that boils everything down to a general protocol that gets applied to everybody. And that is the exact opposite of the point of functional medicine, which is to personalize. In fact, a lot of docs now are using a phrase which is personalized lifestyle medicine, which I completely agree with. All right, let's get back to the testing. By far, the most common test that someone like me is going to run is a stool test. And the labs that I use are specialty labs that test for a much wider array of potential infections than any test a conventional medical doctor, even a gastroenterologist, is typically going to order. It's very common for me to suggest to a new client that, hey, wait, let's run a stool test, only for them to say, well, my MD already did and it was negative. And I can say this honestly, 100% of the time, the tests that these MDs ran used a national lab like Quest or LabCorp, who only look for 4 or 5 organisms that commonly cause acute gastritis. Yet some of these people have had GI issues for months, if not years. But most of these people, again, they're in the chronic stage. They're not acute, and the picture is completely different. And I think it takes just a little bit of logic. So let me ask you this. If your MD runs a test that only looks for 4 to 5 different organisms that could be in your stool, but there are actually dozens, if not hundreds, of potential organisms that could cause your problem, can they truly say after testing for 4 or 5 that your gut is not infected? They can't. Not even close. All they can say is that the test they ran was negative for the 4 to 5 things that they tested for. They can't say, well, you don't have an infection. They can just say, you don't have the infections we looked for. So there's no way that you can rule out all potential pathogens or organisms that could be your problem when you only test for 4 or 5. And this is why using labs that specialize in GI testing is so important, because they cast their net very broadly. They can catch much more than the standard testing that's done in conventional medicine. So stool testing is quite often helpful, not always necessary as a pretest, but always necessary as a post-test, simply because you don't know you're done until a stool test is normal. And the problem here is that, listen, your gut has an amazing capacity to not generate symptoms despite being infected. And a perfect example is the H. pylori that I mentioned earlier. It's the most common infection in the world, with roughly half the general population having it, yet 80% of the time when someone is infected, it's a silent asymptomatic infection. You don't know you're infected, yet you are. And that's why I will sometimes recommend stool testing for someone, even though they don't have any symptoms or many gut symptoms at all, because I know it's possible to be infected, yet not have overt symptoms that alert you to the fact. So you can see that doing stool testing for gut problems is, like everything else, it's not as cut and dried as we might want it to be. So let me talk about another common and very useful test for the gut. Again, there are many. I'm just singling out 2 that are the most common that I would use and I would teach in seminars for other docs to use. And that would be leaky gut. Of course, leaky gut is a potential problem for anyone who has an infected gut, because infections can lead to leaky gut. But realize that you can have a leaky gut with or without an infection, because there are other mechanisms that can cause the leaky gut. So they're not guaranteed to go together, but they very commonly do. It's more common to have an infected and leaky gut than to not have them together, even though they can happen independently. And this is another area where pretesting is not always necessary to implement some kind of a strategy to get rid of it, assuming you have it. But post-testing is always required to know when you're done. But having said that, current state-of-the-art testing doesn't just give us a yay or nay, you do or do not have a leaky gut. It can also help us understand scope and scale, right? Do you have a little baby leaky gut or a big bad wolf leaky gut? And this helps us to understand or to categorize the important part of the Eisenhower matrix, because leaky guts are a big deal, or a leaky gut is a big deal, right? A severe leaky gut is more of a big deal than a mild leaky gut, and proper testing can help us differentiate that. It can help us prioritize. Now, there's a lot of noise being made right now, I'd say the last 2 years, maybe more, about a test called zonulin. You may have heard of this. If not, you eventually will. Zonulin is a protein that's released by the tight junctions in the gut that keep the gut tissue together to give you that barrier system that we've talked about before. And it's released under several conditions. It can cause a transient leaky gut. One of the things that can increase zonulin transiently and cause a transient leaky gut that then kind of goes away is actually eating gluten. Studies show that, I believe the study was out of Australia, probably about 8 or 10 years ago, showed that every single person in the study, when they ate gluten, expressed more zonulin and caused transient leaky gut. Now, the theory is that if zonulin is being produced frequently or chronically, then you have either transient but frequent leaky gut or constant low-grade leaky gut. The problem is that the zonulin test itself is fraught with problems. First of all, you measure it in your blood. And when you do that, you have no way of knowing if the zonulin you're seeing is being produced by the gut or being produced by other organs, because the gut is not the only thing that produces zonulin. And there are some other issues actually as to whether or not we're actually measuring zonulin or measuring a precursor to zonulin, but that's a little bit more technical, a little bit more complicated. So let's put that off to the side for the moment. But I'll tell you, back in 2017, the World Journal of Gastroenterology published a study from two colleagues of mine, Dr. Arista Vijayani and Dr. Datis Karazian. You might recognize at least one of those names. Dr. Karazian's all over the internet these days and has been for about a decade or two. But anyways, they published a study that showed that zonulin varies considerably throughout the day. So you might have high zonulin for a short period in the morning, but the rest of the day it's normal. And so if you measure zonulin at the wrong time, you get the wrong impression. And since zonulin also activates or incites immune system responses, the levels can vary as quickly as every 4 minutes. And furthermore, over a week, zonulin levels can vary by as much as a factor of 10. So maybe you measure it and I'll make up numbers here just so you understand the principle. Maybe on Monday, your zonulin level is 1, but on Thursday, it's 8 or it's 12, something like that, right? So it's all over the place. It's kind of like trying to hit a moving target. And so when you consider the drawbacks, it seems that zonulin, despite what some doctors are saying and some labs are promoting, measuring zonulin is not a great way to check for leaky gut. I don't do it myself. I don't recommend other doctors use it either. And if you're working with a doctor who wants to test that, then they don't understand this aspect of what they're doing. And, I'm not going to call it clinical incompetence, but certainly we could call it clinical naivete. The best way to test for leaky gut is actually a blood test that looks for damage to certain structural proteins that keep the lining of the gut healthy and intact. These are stable, they're consistent, they're easily measured. Plus, they have a very high degree of correlation with not just gut problems, but other metabolic issues as well. Things like metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes, Hashimoto's disease, neurological disorders, etc. Now, with a leaky gut, these structural proteins, and I'll just toss out a couple of names, occludin and actomyosin, these proteins break down and we can detect them in the blood, or more properly, we can detect antibodies to them in the blood. And this is state of the art and a cutting edge science. And as far as I know, the only lab that does this is Cyrex Labs in Phoenix, Arizona. And if you've heard me over the podcast over the last year or so, I've mentioned Cyrex Labs many times. I have no financial interest in them. I don't gain anything by mentioning it or using it in my practice. They're just a lab that I use and that I trust. And I happen to know the guy who sets all the testing up, and that's Dr. Arista Vijayani. He's one of the top immunologists in the world. So why is leaky gut such a problem? Well, I mentioned recently that leaky gut generates both local gut inflammation as well as systemic inflammation, meaning that leaky gut has the potential to affect and amplify problems that you have outside of your gut. And you won't overcome those other issues until you fix your leaky gut. And you won't fix your leaky gut until you fix what causes the leaky gut. And so it's like keep digging until you find root cause. And I've said this as well before, that simply throwing leaky gut supplements like L-glutamine or deglycyrrhizated licorice or Jerusalem artichoke, throwing these things at a leaky gut it's a losing battle if you're not addressing the root cause, right? What if you're using a leaky gut protocol, but you're ignoring multiple gut infections, or maybe you're not aware of or eliminating foods that you're reacting to? or maybe you have an underlying thyroid issue or hormonal imbalance. And all of these things, either individually or together, can create and perpetuate a leaky gut that no supplement by itself is going to fix. You have to use the supplements to heal the tissue, but you also have to fix the underlying root cause. And that leads me to reiterate that your gut is a system of systems. Your brain, your hormones, and your immune system all converge in one place in the gut. And so the proper testing and care of gut issues can be as simple as stool testing and a diet shift, all the way to multiple tests spanning different focal points and multiple treatment strategies. It all depends on your case and what you're dealing with. And that's probably a good place for me to stop today. I'd like to remind you about the lab shop where you can get access to these tests that I use, again, with my direct coaching clients. You don't need a doctor's prescription. So if you're interested in checking this out for yourself as it relates to our conversation today, let me suggest two things. You can go into the lab shop. You can use the link that's in the episode description. Take a look at the GI map from Diagnostic Solutions. Listen, there are several labs out there that do good, solid GI testing. There's different technologies that are available. Diagnostic Solutions, these guys are state of the art. They use DNA PCR testing, which is literally 1,000 times more sensitive than the old school test where a lab tech looks through a microscope at a sample of stool to see if they can see little wigglies floating around there, right? This is the same technology that we use to determine viral loads and things like hepatitis C or even coronavirus infections, right? This is my go-to test for determining if someone has a gut infection. I am not sponsored by the lab. They don't pay me to say this. I'm telling you what I do in my own practice. And while you're there, if you go to the lab shop, look at the GI map from Diagnostic Solutions, but also check out Cyrex Labs Array 2. That's Array 2, and that's their test for leaky gut, or what they call intestinal permeability, right? This is the best leaky gut test on the market, and it's going to help you see if you have a leaky gut and, again, how severe it is. And again, they don't pay me to say that. It's a lab that I use. I know and trust the people who are behind the lab. Now, one more thing before I go, because I know how complex and detailed the gut can be. I've created an online course called the 5-Step Gut Protocol, right? It walks you through how the gut works, what goes wrong, how you can help yourself. It's packed with video lessons created and narrated by me, yours truly. It's got supporting PDF materials, a workbook. You can do this at your own pace. The course itself is dirt cheap, especially when you compare it to what other internet experts are charging for their courses. And they typically have a lot less detail, a lot less information. So please check that out. You can use the, again, link in the episode description. All right, guys, next episode, we're going to move on away from the gut. We're going to talk about the thyroid, and we're going to talk about where that sits in the functional hierarchy of health. I'll see you guys next time.